Frank Harrison's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as snow began to blur his windshield. His 8-year-old daughter Katie hummed softly in the back seat, her breath fogging the window as she traced invisible patterns with her finger. The familiar route home from Lincoln Elementary should have been routine, just another Friday pickup in their quiet life. But something made him slow down at the Oak Street bus stop. Through the thickening snowfall, a figure sat motionless in a wheelchair, thin shoulders hunched against the bitter wind. The last bus had left 30 minutes ago. Frank pulled over, his truck's headlights cutting through the grey twilight, to reveal a young woman, maybe 19, her lips already turning blue from the cold. "Come with me," he would say moments later, not knowing those 3 simple words would change everything. What Frank didn't realize was that this wasn't a random act of kindness. It was the beginning of a story that had started years before, in ways he never could have imagined. The heating vents in Frank's old Chevy truck hummed steadily as he watched the girl through his side mirror. She hadn't moved in the 5 minutes he'd been sitting there, engine idling, windshield wipers fighting the accumulating snow. Katie had stopped humming and was now pressing her face against the window, her curious 8-year-old eyes fixed on the stranger. The temperature outside was dropping fast, and Frank could see his own breath when he cracked the window slightly. The girl's thin cardigan offered little protection against the harsh Wisconsin winter, and her hands, gripping the wheelchair's armrests, had taken on an alarming shade of purple. Something about her posture spoke of resignation rather than waiting, as if she had nowhere else to go and had simply accepted her fate. Frank turned off the engine and stepped out into the biting wind, his work boots crunching through the fresh snow. The girl looked up as he approached, her dark eyes holding a mixture of wariness and exhaustion that seemed far too old for someone barely out of her teens. Snowflakes clung to her auburn hair, and she instinctively pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Behind him, he could hear Katie rolling down the window slightly, her young voice carrying on the wind as she called out, "Dad, is she okay?" The question hung in the cold air between them, and Frank found himself studying the girl's face more closely. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place, like a song he'd heard before but couldn't name. "Miss, the last bus already left about 30 minutes ago," Frank said gently, his voice cutting through the wind. The girl's eyes met his briefly before darting away, focusing on something in the distance. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, hoarse from the cold. Frank glanced back at his truck where Katie's concerned face was pressed against the window, then looked around the deserted street. The next bus wouldn't come until Monday morning, and the temperature was supposed to drop below freezing tonight. "You have somewhere to go? Family nearby?" he asked, though something in her expression already told him the answer. The girl's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she shook her head once, a quick, sharp movement that spoke of pride fighting against desperation. The wind picked up, sending a fresh wave of snow swirling around them, and Frank watched as the girl involuntarily shivered. Her wheelchair was an older model, the kind covered by basic insurance, and the blanket across her legs was thin and inadequate for the weather. Frank's mind raced through his options, weighing the risks of bringing a stranger home against the certainty of what would happen if he left her here. Katie's voice carried from the truck again. "Dad, why is she sitting in the snow?" The innocent question cut through his hesitation like a knife. He thought of his late wife, Sarah, who had never been able to walk past someone in need without stopping. She would have already invited the girl home, would have probably wrapped her in Frank's coat and fussed over her like a mother hen. "Look, it's going to be below freezing tonight," Frank said, taking a step closer, but careful not to invade her space. "The next bus isn't until Monday morning, and the shelters downtown are probably full on a night like this." The girl's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or hurt. "I don't need charity." she said, her voice stronger now, carrying a pride that Frank recognized. He'd seen it in his own mirror during those dark months after Sarah's death, when well-meaning neighbors had tried to help with Katie, and he'd pushed them all away. "This isn't charity," Frank replied quietly, his tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "This is just what people do for each other." The girl looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth or just saying what he thought she wanted to hear. Frank could feel Katie's eyes on him from the truck, and he knew his daughter was absorbing every word of this conversation, filing it away in that sharp mind of hers. The snow was falling harder now, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the empty street. "I'm Frank Harrison," he said, extending his hand despite the cold. "That's my daughter Katie in the truck. We live about 5 minutes from here." The girl stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before slowly reaching out to shake it. Her fingers were ice-cold and trembling slightly. "Amber," she said simply, and Frank noticed she didn't offer a last name. "Amber Cole," she added after a pause, as if remembering her manners. The name meant nothing to him, but something about the way she said it made him think she was testing whether he recognized it. The moment stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind and Katie's muffled voice asking questions from the truck. Frank could see Amber weighing her options, her dark eyes moving from his face to the truck to the empty street around them. "Come with me," Frank said finally, the words coming out more like a gentle command than a request. "Just for tonight. You can figure out what's next tomorrow when it's not snowing and you're not about to freeze to death." Amber's eyes widened slightly at his directness, and for a moment Frank thought she might refuse again. Then she looked down at her hands, purple from the cold, and seemed to deflate slightly. "I don't even know you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No, you don't," Frank agreed. "But sometimes that's when people surprise you." Amber was quiet for so long that Frank began to wonder if she'd changed her mind. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it over the wind. She said, "Just for tonight?" The vulnerability in her voice made something tighten in Frank's chest. "Just for tonight," he confirmed, though something told him even as he said it that neither of them quite believed it would be that simple. Without another word, Frank moved behind her wheelchair and began pushing it toward the truck. Amber's hands tensed on the armrests for a moment, clearly not used to accepting help, but she didn't protest. The short distance to the truck felt longer than it should have, each step crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep. Katie had rolled her window down completely now, despite the cold, and was watching their approach with wide, curious eyes. The truck had a small lift gate that Frank had installed 3 years ago when Sarah's mobility had declined, and he was grateful for it now as he helped Amber transfer from her wheelchair to the passenger seat. She moved with practiced efficiency, clearly used to navigating the world from wheels, but Frank could see the effort it took. Katie immediately launched into introductions from the back seat, her natural friendliness overcoming any shyness. "Hi, I'm Katie. What's your name? Are you cold? Dad always makes the car really warm, maybe too warm sometimes." Amber turned in her seat to look at the little girl, and Frank caught a flicker of something soft crossing her face before she answered. "I'm Amber, and yes, I'm very cold." Katie beamed as if this was the best news she'd heard all day. "Well, now you'll be warm." As Frank folded Amber's wheelchair and secured it in the truck bed, he caught her watching him through the side mirror. There was something almost desperate in her gaze, as if she couldn't quite believe this was happening. The drive to his house took exactly 4 minutes, during which Katie chatted about her day at school, while Amber sat silently, occasionally responding to direct questions, but mostly just staring out the window. Frank found himself glancing at her frequently, trying to place that nagging sense of familiarity. When they pulled into his driveway, a modest two-story house with a wraparound porch that Sarah had insisted on, Amber seemed to study it with unusual intensity. The warm yellow light spilling from the front windows created a welcoming glow against the white snow, and Frank realized it had been a long time since he'd seen his home through a stranger's eyes. Katie bounded out of the truck and up the front steps, calling over her shoulder, "Come on, Amber, I'll show you my room later." Frank retrieved the wheelchair and helped Amber transfer back into it, noticing how she moved with the kind of careful precision that spoke of recent adaptation rather than lifelong use. The front porch had a ramp, another modification from Sarah's final months, and Amber navigated it easily. At the front door, she paused and looked up at Frank with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I haven't been inside a real home in months," she said quietly, and something in her voice suggested this admission cost her something. Frank pushed open the door, warm air and the scent of the morning's coffee still lingering in the kitchen, rushing out to greet them. "Well, it's not much," he said, stepping aside to let her enter first. "But it's warm." The Harrison house felt different with Amber in it, as if her presence had shifted something fundamental about the space. Katie immediately began the grand tour, pointing out the living room with its worn but comfortable furniture, the kitchen where Dad makes the best pancakes on Saturdays, and the family photos that covered nearly every surface. Frank watched Amber's face as she took it all in, noting how her eyes lingered on the pictures of Sarah, particularly one from Katie's 6th birthday, where his late wife was laughing, flour in her hair from baking. The house carried the unmistakable marks of a family that had been larger once, spaces that seemed designed for 3 people but now held only 2. Amber's gaze moved to a child's drawing on the refrigerator, held up with a magnet that read, "World's Best Mom." And Frank saw her swallow hard. The evening took on an almost surreal quality as the 3 of them settled into an unexpected routine. Frank heated up leftover soup while Katie showed Amber her collection of books, insisting on reading aloud from her current favorite. Amber listened with genuine attention, asking questions that made Katie glow with pride. Over dinner, conversation came easier than Frank had expected, though he noticed Amber deflected any personal questions with the skill of someone who'd had practice. She was clearly educated, her vocabulary and references suggesting college, but there was a guardedness about her that spoke of recent trauma. When Katie asked about her wheelchair, Amber simply said, "I was in an accident," and the finality in her tone discouraged further questions. As the evening wore on, Frank found himself studying Amber more closely. The nagging sense of familiarity grew stronger, particularly when she laughed at something Katie said. The sound was musical and genuine, transforming her face entirely, and for a moment Frank felt like he was seeing her as she'd been before whatever had brought her to that bus stop. There was an intelligence in her eyes that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. When Katie finally began to yawn, Frank suggested it was time for bed, and the little girl surprised him by hugging Amber goodnight, as if they'd known each other for years. "You'll still be here tomorrow, right?" Katie asked, and Frank saw Amber hesitate before nodding. "For a little while," she said softly. After Katie was tucked in bed, Frank and Amber sat in the living room with cups of coffee, the snow still falling steadily outside the windows. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was weighted with unasked questions. Frank found himself looking at the framed photo of Sarah on the mantelpiece, wondering what his wife would have thought of bringing home a stranger. Amber followed his gaze and said quietly, "She's beautiful. Katie has her eyes." Frank nodded, surprised by the observation's accuracy. "Sarah would have liked you," he said without thinking, then immediately wondered why he'd said it. Amber looked at him sharply, something flickering across her face too quickly to interpret. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier edge. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with snow still falling intermittently. Frank woke early as always, but the sound of movement in the kitchen surprised him. He found Amber there, having somehow managed to make coffee and toast despite the height of the counters. She looked up when he entered, a defensive expression already forming. "I wanted to help," she said quickly. "I'm not used to being taken care of." Frank poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, studying her face in the morning light. Without makeup and with her hair pulled back, she looked even younger, and the familiar feeling nagged at him again. "You don't have to earn your keep," he said gently. "You're not a burden." Amber's jaw tightened, and Frank realized he'd hit a nerve. Katie's appearance broke the tension, the little girl chattering excitedly about the snow and asking if they could build a snowman after breakfast. Amber watched the interaction between father and daughter with something that might have been longing, and Frank caught her wiping her eyes quickly when she thought no one was looking. Over pancakes, Katie peppered Amber with questions about her life, displaying the innocent curiosity of childhood. Where did she live? Did she have any pets? What was her favorite color? Amber answered carefully, revealing little while seeming to answer everything. Frank noticed she never mentioned family or friends, and when Katie asked about her parents, Amber simply said they weren't around anymore. The way she said it suggested finality rather than distance. The day passed quietly, with Katie entertaining their guest while Frank caught up on household chores. He found himself making excuses to check on them, drawn by the sound of Amber's laughter as Katie showed her photo albums and told increasingly elaborate stories about her adventures at school. There was something healing about watching his daughter interact with another person who wasn't trying to replace her mother or fix their small family. Amber seemed to understand instinctively how to talk to Katie, neither talking down to her nor overwhelming her with adult concerns. When Frank suggested they order pizza for dinner, Katie clapped her hands and declared it a celebration, though what they were celebrating remained unclear. That evening, as snow continued to blanket the town, Frank found himself reluctant to bring up the subject of Amber's next move. She hadn't mentioned leaving again, and Katie had begun talking about all the things she wanted to show Amber over the weekend. After dinner, while Katie was absorbed in a puzzle, Amber wheeled herself over to where Frank was loading the dishwasher. "I should probably find somewhere else to go," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. Frank paused in his work, considering his response carefully. "Where would you go?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, and Amber's silence was answer enough. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the harsh reality waiting beyond the warm walls of the Harrison house. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Amber seemed to relax incrementally, losing some of her defensive posture as Katie's endless enthusiasm wore down her walls. Frank watched her help his daughter with homework, patiently explaining math concepts that clearly came easily to her. When he asked about her education, Amber mentioned she'd been studying biology before her accident, but she changed the subject quickly. There were moments when Frank caught her staring into space, with an expression of profound sadness, but she always seemed to shake it off when she noticed him watching. The familiarity he felt when looking at her had grown stronger, nagging at him like a word on the tip of his tongue. On Sunday evening, after Katie had gone to bed, Frank sat in his study looking through old photo albums, trying to place where he might have seen Amber before. Sarah had been a social person, always involved in various activities and causes, and their house had seen countless dinner parties and gatherings over the years. As he flipped through pictures from their college days, university functions, and Sarah's volunteer work, he paused at a photo from a scholarship fundraiser they'd attended about 4 years ago. In the background, partly obscured by other guests, was a young woman in a graduation cap and gown. Frank brought the photo closer to the lamp, his heart beginning to race as recognition dawned. The girl in the photo was definitely younger, healthier looking, but the bone structure was unmistakable. It was Amber. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he studied the photo more carefully. Sarah was in the foreground, presenting an award to a group of scholarship recipients. The event had been for students who'd overcome significant challenges to pursue higher education. He remembered Sarah coming home that night, excited about the young people she'd met, particularly one girl whose story had moved her deeply. "She's going to change the world," Sarah had said about someone that night, though Frank couldn't remember the details. He racked his brain, trying to recall the conversation, but it had been just months before Sarah's diagnosis, when their world had begun to tilt toward chaos. Now, sitting in the quiet house with snow still falling outside, Frank wondered if fate had brought Amber to that bus stop, or if there was something more deliberate about her presence in their lives. The next morning, Frank found Amber in the kitchen again, this time managing to make scrambled eggs, despite the challenges of cooking from a wheelchair. Katie was helping, standing on a step stool and chattering about her plans for the day. The domestic scene struck Frank as both foreign and somehow inevitable, as if this was how their mornings were supposed to look. When Katie left the room to get dressed for school, Frank seized the opportunity to show Amber the photograph. He placed it gently on the table in front of her, watching as her face went pale and her hands began to shake. "Sarah's Scholarship Foundation," he said quietly. "You were there 4 years ago." Amber stared at the photo for a long moment before looking up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and something that might have been relief. "She talked about you," Frank continued, his voice gentle but insistent. "That night when she came home, she couldn't stop talking about this brilliant young woman who was going to study marine biology. She said you'd overcome more in your life than most people face in a lifetime." Amber's composure cracked slightly, and Frank saw tears threatening in her eyes. "That was before," she said simply, gesturing to her wheelchair. "Before the accident. Before I lost my scholarship. Before I lost everything." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut, and Frank felt something shift in his understanding of who this young woman really was. The girl Sarah had been so excited about, and the broken person he'd found at the bus stop were the same, but the journey between those 2 points must have been devastating. Katie's return to the kitchen interrupted the moment, but Frank could see that something fundamental had changed between him and Amber. Throughout the day, he found himself thinking about Sarah's words from that night years ago, how she'd insisted that some people were meant to do extraordinary things despite extraordinary obstacles. When he'd asked how she could be so certain, Sarah had smiled and said, "Because I can see it in her eyes. She has the kind of strength that only comes from surviving what should have broken her." Now, watching Amber patiently help Katie with the science project, Frank thought he understood what Sarah had seen. The strength was still there, buried under layers of hurt and disappointment, but unmistakably present. That evening, after Katie was asleep, Frank found Amber sitting by the living room window, watching the snow fall. The silence between them felt different now, charged with unspoken recognition. "She would have remembered you," Frank said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. "Sarah never forgot anyone who made an impression on her, and you definitely did." Amber turned to look at him, her expression vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "I remember her too," she admitted. "She was the first person in a long time who looked at me and saw potential instead of problems. When I got my scholarship, I thought I was finally going to make something of myself, prove that I could rise above where I came from." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and Frank felt his heart contract with sympathy. "What happened?" Frank asked gently, though he suspected the answer would be painful to hear. Amber was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then, slowly, she began to tell him about the car accident 18 months ago, how a drunk driver had hit her while she was walking back to her dorm after a late study session. The impact had damaged her spinal cord, ending her scholarship and her dreams in one terrible moment. She told him about the months of rehabilitation, the foster family who'd taken her in, but eventually asked her to leave when caring for her became too difficult, and the series of temporary housing situations that had led her to that bus stop. With each detail, Frank felt his anger growing, not at Amber, but at the cruel randomness of a world that could take so much from someone who'd already lost so much. The next few days passed in a careful dance of growing familiarity and unspoken questions about the future. Frank found himself researching disability services and educational opportunities, though he was careful not to let Amber see what he was doing. He called Sarah's former colleagues at the Scholarship Foundation, learning more about Amber's academic record and the circumstances that had led to her losing her funding. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who'd fought her way out of poverty and foster care through sheer intelligence and determination, only to have it all taken away by circumstances beyond her control. Frank began to understand why Amber had been so resistant to his help. She'd learned that counting on others led only to disappointment. Katie, blissfully unaware of the complex emotions swirling around the adults in her life, had fully adopted Amber as a new fixture in their household. She insisted Amber help her with homework, invited her to watch movies, and had even convinced her to play board games, despite Amber's initial protests that she wasn't good with children. Frank watched these interactions with growing amazement, seeing how naturally Amber slipped into an almost sisterly role with Katie. The little girl seemed to bloom under the attention, and Frank realized how much his daughter had missed having another female presence in the house. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, but seeing Katie with Amber made him understand how deeply his daughter still felt that absence. One evening, while Katie was at a sleepover with a friend from school, Frank and Amber found themselves alone in the house for the first time since that snowy night. The silence felt weighted with possibility and uncertainty. Frank had been thinking all day about a conversation he'd had with Sarah's former supervisor at the foundation, who'd mentioned that they were looking for someone to help with their online outreach and could offer flexible hours for the right candidate. He'd also learned about programs that could help Amber return to school, though he wasn't sure how to bring up either topic without seeming presumptuous. As they sat in the living room after dinner, Frank found himself studying Amber's profile as she gazed out at the snow-covered yard. In the soft lamplight, he could see echoes of the confident young woman Sarah had met years ago, and something told him that person was still there, waiting for the right opportunity to re-emerge. "I've been thinking," Frank said carefully, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what comes next, I mean." Amber turned to look at him, wariness immediately creeping into her expression. Frank held up a hand to forestall her protests. "Not about you leaving, about you staying." The words hung in the air between them, and Frank saw something flicker across Amber's face that might have been hope. "Katie adores you," he continued, "and I think you're good for her in ways I can't be. But more than that, I think maybe we're good for you, too." Amber's eyes filled with tears, and Frank could see her struggling between the desire to believe him and the fear of another disappointment. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "I'm not the same person your wife met. I'm broken now." Frank leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but kind. "You know what Sarah used to say? She said broken things can be mended, and sometimes they're stronger after than they were before." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not offering charity, Amber. I'm offering family. Katie needs someone like you in her life, and honestly, so do I. This house has felt empty for too long." Amber stared at him through her tears, clearly struggling to process what he was saying. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would you want that? You barely know me." Frank smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile he'd worn in days. "Sometimes," he said, echoing words he'd spoken at a snowy bus stop, "that's when people surprise you." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, with Frank sharing his ideas about the foundation job and educational opportunities, while Amber slowly began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't too good to be true. They talked about practical matters like accessibility modifications to the house and how to help Katie understand that Amber would be staying permanently. But underneath the logistics, something deeper was taking shape, a recognition that they could build something together that none of them could have alone. When Amber finally said yes, her voice was barely a whisper, but Frank heard it clearly enough. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like his family was complete again, though in a way he never could have imagined. The following months brought changes both subtle and profound to the Harrison household. Amber's presence transformed their daily routines in countless small ways, from the sound of different laughter echoing through the halls to the sight of textbooks and online course materials spread across the kitchen table where she'd resumed her studies. The Scholarship Foundation had indeed offered her a position doing outreach work, and watching her confidence slowly rebuild as she helped other students navigate the challenges she'd faced was like watching someone learn to breathe again. Katie thrived under Amber's attention, her grades improving as Amber helped with homework and her social confidence growing as she proudly introduced her friends to her sister Amber. Frank found himself changing too, the tight knot of grief and responsibility he'd carried since Sarah's death gradually loosening as he watched his makeshift family flourish. He'd worried that having another woman in the house might feel like he was trying to replace Sarah, but instead it felt like honoring her memory in the best possible way. Amber never tried to be Katie's mother, but she filled a role that had been vacant for too long, offering the kind of guidance and understanding that only another woman could provide. When Katie got her first period several months later, it was Amber who handled the situation with exactly the right mixture of matter-of-fact practicality and gentle reassurance, and Frank felt a gratitude so profound it took his breath away. The 1-year anniversary of that snowy night passed quietly, marked only by Katie insisting they celebrate Amber Day with homemade cake and silly gifts. As Frank watched Amber laugh at Katie's joke about how she'd rescued Amber from becoming a snow woman, he marveled at how completely their lives had intertwined. Amber had grown stronger and more confident, but she'd also brought out sides of himself and Katie that had been dormant since Sarah's death. The house rang with laughter again, filled with the kind of easy warmth that could only come from people who truly belonged together. That evening, after Katie had gone to bed, Frank and Amber sat on the front porch despite the cold, looking out at the same bus stop where their story had begun. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if it hadn't been snowing that night?" Amber asked, her breath visible in the cold air. Frank considered the question seriously, as he had many times over the past year. "I think somehow we would have found each other anyway," he said finally. "Sarah used to say that some things are just meant to be." Amber smiled, the expression transforming her face in the way that still sometimes took Frank's breath away. "She was a wise woman," Amber said softly. "I wish I could have known her better." Frank reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "You do know her," he said. "Every day you help Katie become the kind of person Sarah dreamed she'd be. Every time you refuse to give up on your own dreams, every time you choose hope over fear, you're living the life Sarah believed you could have." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching snow begin to fall again, Frank thought about the strange arithmetic of love and loss. Sarah's death had taken something irreplaceable from their lives, but it had also created the space for Amber to join their family. He didn't believe his wife had orchestrated their meeting from beyond, but he did believe she would have approved of the way things had worked out. Katie had gained a sister and role model. Amber had found the family and stability she'd never had, and Frank had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather finding new ways to honor the past while building toward the future. The house behind them glowed with warm light, filled with the kind of contentment that could only come from people who had chosen each other not out of obligation or convenience, but out of genuine love and need. 2 years later, as Frank watched Amber cross the stage to receive her marine biology degree, he thought about the night that had changed all their lives. Katie, now 10 and fierce in her pride for her sister, cheered loudly from their seats in the auditorium. Amber had insisted that Katie call her sister rather than anything more formal, and the title fit perfectly. They weren't a traditional family by any definition, but they were undeniably family nonetheless. After the ceremony, as they celebrated at Amber's favorite restaurant, Frank raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said, looking at the two most important women in his life. "And to the people brave enough to take them." Amber's eyes filled with happy tears as she clinked her glass against his and Katie's, and Frank knew that Sarah, wherever she was, would have been proud of all of them. The future stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainty but also possibility. Amber had been accepted to graduate school, Katie was growing into a confident and compassionate young woman, and Frank had learned that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but multiplied instead. As they drove home through the familiar streets of their town, Frank glanced in the rearview mirror at Amber and Katie laughing together in the back seat and felt a profound sense of gratitude for that snowy night when a stranger's need had become his family's greatest gift. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as problems to be solved, and sometimes the people you were meant to love found you in the most unexpected places. In the end, Frank thought, the words that had started it all, "Come with me," had been less of an invitation than a recognition of something that had always been meant to be.